This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome back to Principles of Macroeconomics. I'm happy to have all of you here in week two. It's going by fast already. We started week one back on Wednesday, and we're already in week two, if you could believe that or not. So this course moves quickly. And I know that it seems like it's a long time because it's 15 weeks, but I tell you, it moves very, very fast. So this week, we're going to cover two chapters. We're going to cover chapters 2 and 3. And so let's just do a quick recap of last week, and then we'll jump into this week. From last week, in the classroom opening up week one, you had two action items, if I'm not mistaken. One of those was the week one discussion board, which is found under week one, Engage and Explore. You were required to have an original post and respond to two of your classmates, which most of you kind of did. There's a few that decided not to do responses, which is okay, but you obviously get penalized in the grade for that. So for every discussion board moving forward, just know that you have to do one original post and respond to two of your classmates. That's how you'll earn full credit for the discussion board. The other action item that you had was the Chapter 1 quiz, which, again, almost all of you did. Some of you joined the class late. You enrolled into this course late, which I understand that. Some of you, this is your first day at UDC. You got your schedule on Friday, and then you got your courses, and so obviously you missed the first week. So what that means is I need you to get caught up as quickly as you can. So I'll need you to complete that week one discussion board and the Chapter 1 quiz as soon as you possibly can. And the reason for that is because we're going to cover chapters 2 and 3 starting today. And so if you've fallen behind because maybe you joined the class late or you were unaware that you had a discussion board and a quiz that were due yesterday, please make sure that we get those done as soon as possible. Yeah. I want to make sure that you still get credit, even if you started the course late. So that was from last week, and then this week we are going to go over chapters 2 and 3. So starting with week 2, a couple of pieces of information for you to look at. One is the week at a glance. Here you'll find the overview of what we're going to cover this week, some additional information on how we're going to cover it, the learning objectives, and then, of course, your action items, which are reading the chapters, reviewing the PowerPoint presentations, and, of course, attending the lecture. And for this week, we're going to have our first hypothesis annotation, and we are also going to have a quiz on Chapter 2, and then we'll also, for Chapter 3, we'll also have a quiz. So, how to find the lectures, PowerPoint presentations that we're about to cover. If you go into instructional materials, click on the instructional materials area, and you will find the PowerPoint presentations for today. The first one is the Chapter 2 PowerPoint, which we're about to cover. You can open it up like this, or you can download it, whatever is easiest for you. And then also the PowerPoint for Chapter 3 is there. So you want to make sure that you have access to both of those. And then some additional content is down here. Yeah. And so that is where you'll find the learning information for this week. And then for this week related to this chapter, we will have a hypothesis annotation assignment, which I'll show you how to access that here after the lecture. And there's also going to be a quiz related to this chapter and for the following chapter as well. So 3 action items will be due for this Sunday night. One is a hypothesis, 1 original post, and 2 responses to classmates. And then you'll have Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 quiz. So 3 action items due for this Sunday night. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into Chapter 2, Thinking Like an Economist. And hopefully, yep. Oops. Cool, it works. Okay, so last week we talked about the 10 principles of economics. And in the 10 principles, we, in a very basic sense, formed a basic understanding of the foundation of economics. We looked at a very foundational level, the principles. This chapter is connected to the previous chapter. This one's called Thinking Like an Economist. And the idea here is that we're going to explore how economists look at the economy, right? That's the basics of thinking like an economist. So I want you to think about what is economics. Well, we know that economics is the study of the economy, and the economy is made up of markets and transactions in a very general sense. We look at economics as being a science. And the reason why economics is a science is because there's a lot of data that we're analyzing and looking at to really understand how economics works. When it comes to an economist is an individual that studies economics, right? We look at creating theories, collecting data, analyzing that data to verify or even refute or dispute someone else's theory. And we do this from a scientific approach. If you've ever completed a research study, or if you've done any kind of research, you've kind of gone through this process already. What I mean by that is you've gathered resources, whether it be from articles that you read, or maybe you gathered from some numerical data from an Excel workbook or whatever. You gathered data. First, you figured, hey, there's a problem here that I'd like to explore. You gathered data around that problem. You analyzed that data, and you produced maybe a theory, or at least you summarized that information. That's a scientific approach to research. So anytime that you do research, think of it from this scientific approach, because that's really what it is. And we look at economists doing the same exact thing as you have done possibly in the past when it comes to completing a research study. So what's the scientific method behind it? The economists create theories about economics through observation, existing theory, and more observation. That's really how it's done. It's a cyclical approach. There's a lot of really popular economics theories that were developed by economists. And throughout this course, we're going to explore some of those. One that you may probably already heard of, maybe in a statistics class, is called the bell curve. I don't know if you remember what the bell curve is, but it's shaped like a bell. The graph goes up, and then it comes back down on the other side, shaped like a bell. The bell curve was actually developed by an economist. And just to give you an idea of some theories that famous economists have developed. Oftentimes, these theories, they're tested in a very experimental way, and they're tested again, they collect more data, test it again, and eventually they develop a theory that works. Instead of a laboratory that you'd normally have, the economists look at what we call natural experiments, and they're often based off of historical figures. You may have heard this, somebody say, hey, history repeats itself. In economics, that's very true. You'll notice that the economy is very cyclical in nature. It goes up and it goes down depending on the time of year It goes up and it goes down depending on certain events. It goes up, it goes down based off of other factors that all play in. But you'll notice that year after year, it goes up and down around the same times. And if you look at a 10-year span, you'll notice that it continually goes up incrementally. So there's a lot of theories behind why that is. And that's what economists do, is they study those types of behaviors. And they do that through identifying assumptions. There are certain assumptions that come into play. There's an assumption of supply and demand. The idea here is that the prices of goods are set by the open market, which is supply and demand. The greater the supply, the greater the demand. Yeah? And supply and demand are graphically, they intersect in the middle. And when supply and demand intersects, we call that the point of equilibrium. These are assumptions. We assume that that's the case, but it's not always the case. It's an assumption. We can simplify things by assuming things in economics. Helps us to make decisions in a more simplistic way. When there's different assumptions, there's going to be different answers to the questions. So in economics, we look at the short run and the long run. The short run is like the month of August. That's a short run. Okay? The long run is the whole 12 months, the year. That's the long run. So that's how you want to think about short run and long run. A couple of different economic models that we oftentimes look at to understand economics in a visual perspective. We look at diagrams and equations, and sometimes we omit a lot of details because we're only looking at certain aspects, to make assumptions. It allows us to see what's important because we can see the graph and the direction that it's heading in. We build it with assumptions in mind, and we do it to simplify things, to make it understandable. So that's what is all involved in developing economic models. From a visual perspective, we oftentimes look at what we call a circular flow diagram. Think of two circles that are placed next to each other. In the middle, they overlap, so you put one circle on top of another. In the very middle, they overlap. That's a circular flow, what they call Venn diagram. We also look at a circular flow diagram to represent the relationship between two things. In economics, we look at the relationship between a household. Remember, a household represents the people that live in the house, a household. And the firm, the companies. Okay? We look at the relationship between the two. Individuals who live in a household, they work at the company. And there's a relationship there. The input for the company is labor. The output is the paycheck. And the paycheck goes to the input for the household, which is the income. And the household spends, that's money, that's the output. It's a circular flow diagram. I'll show you what it looks like here shortly. There's two parts of the factor. There's households and firms. That's what we look at. This is what makes up an economy. The households represent the people that live in the houses within the country. And the firms are the companies that supply the goods and services. And the people in the households work at those companies. The companies supply goods and services to the households. They also supply income to the households. See the relationship. So there's really the two markets for goods and services, the households and the firms. And we look at the factors of production, which we call inputs. So if you think about the economy as a whole, there's two markets within the economy. There's the households and the firms. The companies produce the goods and services, and the households consume those goods and services. On the other side of that, the households work for the firms, therefore the households receive income from the firms, and then they spend that income on goods and services. You see how it works? It's cyclical. It's circular. I'm going to show you the graph here shortly to help it make a little bit more sense. The markets for goods and services are based off of the firms selling the goods and services and the households buying those goods and services. Okay? When it comes to the production side of those goods and services, the companies are the buyers. What we mean by that is the people that live in the households work for the company. The company produces the goods and services. So the input here is the labor from the household. You see what I'm saying? Here is the chart that I wanted to show you. This helps make sense of the circular flow diagram. We have the green line and the red line. On the left side, we see the companies, the firms. On the right side, we see the households. Here, I want you to think about this now. The households, they work for the firms. So the output from the household is labor. Yeah, they work for the company. The household output is labor. They work for the company. So following the red line on the inner side of this circular flow diagram. Households, the output is labor. The people work for the companies. So labor is an input for the firms. The firms produce goods and services. Goods and services are the outputs for the firms. Those goods and services are bought by the households. So goods and services is an input for the households. You see what I'm saying? Now, that's the physical side of things, goods and services and labor. What about the revenue? What about the money? Okay, so let's think about the money here. The households purchase goods and services from the firms. So the output for the households is spending. That spending is revenue for the firms. It's an input for the firms. So it's money coming out of the households and into the firms because the households are buying goods and services from the firms, you see? The output for the firms are the wages and expenses. So think about that. The households work for the firms. The firms pay the households wages. So therefore, we see the output of the firms as wages, and that becomes an input for the households as in a form of income. Does that make sense to everyone? We get this how this works, right? The households work at the firms produce the goods and services and they sell them to the households. The households also receive the income from working at the firm. You see? It's cyclical. It goes back and forth. Any question? It makes sense, right? Okay, great. All right, moving on. Yes, it's a cycle. Exactly. You got it. You got it. It's just a cycle. Okay, let's complicate it a little bit more. Economists also look at what we call the production possibilities frontier. The production possibilities frontier tell us in a graphical way about the combinations of outputs that the economy can possibly produce. Think about it from a manufacturing perspective. Companies will produce as much goods and services as they possibly can. They maximize their level of output. When you maximize your level of output, you're producing as much as you possibly can. Possibilities, right? Production possibilities. All of this is given the factors of production and the production technology. What we mean by that is, in order for the company, the firm, to produce as much as they possibly can, we've got to have enough employees from the households to produce, right? That's one of the inputs. We also have to have good enough technology for us to maximize our production. So those are the inputs. Okay. So in looking at the production possibilities frontier graph, here's what we have. We can see that there are maximum points of production. This graph, from an example, shows us a combination of things. Here we have a company that produces cars and computers. Okay, they produce both cars and computers. And the production is based off of the amount of the inputs. We can see that with this particular company producing both cars and computers, there's going to be maximum amounts to produce both. Okay? For example, at point A on this graph on the line, the company can produce 2,200 computers and 600 cars. That's the most they can produce given those two factors. They can produce at most 2,200 computers and 600 cars. What if they produced less computers? Well, that means they have the capacity to produce more cars. So if we drop by 200 computers, we can increase by 100 cars. So at point B, 2,000 computers, 700 cars. Point C is unattainable. They can't do it. Why? Because it's outside the production possibilities frontier line. It's impossible for the company to produce both 3,000 computers and 600 cars because they don't have that capacity. Point D, they could easily produce 1,000 computers and only 300 cars and still have a lot more room to go. Point E, they could produce 1,000 cars and 500 computers. Yeah, definitely. And then point F, they can produce 3,000 computers and about 100 cars. If you look at this graph, we can see where the optimal levels of production are, probably between points A and B. That's what we call it production possibilities frontier. The idea is that we're maximizing our output. We call that being efficient when you maximize your output. The economy is getting all it can from the scarce resources available. That's being efficient. Remember, the scarce resources, That is people, labor, and it's also the income, right? And the natural resources. Those are scarce. Yep. The efficient levels of production are represented by the points on the production possibilities frontier, the one I just showed you, the graph. The trade-off here is that we can only produce more of one good over another. You notice that, right? So like if we go back to the graph, I can either produce more computers or more cars. I can't produce more of both. I don't have that capacity. So the production possibilities frontier is only on this line. So it's a trade-off between one or the other. Moving from point A to B, we gave up to 200 computers to produce 100 more cars. That's the trade-off. There's also what we call inefficient levels of production. Those are the points inside the production possibilities frontier. So what is inefficient here would be point D. That's inefficient. They're not maximizing their capacity. And then the opportunity cost of producing one good is what we give up in the other. So in order for us to produce 100 more cars, we had to give up 200 computers. So the opportunity cost is the cost of that 200 computers. You'll notice that graph, it's bowed outward, and that's representative of our optimal production. The opportunity cost of the car, of course, is going to be higher than the opportunity cost of the computers. If we're producing a lot of cars, we're producing less computers, right? It's all about maximizing production. When the cost of the car is lower, that means the economy is producing fewer cars and a lot more computers. We focus a lot on resource specialization. So we're trying to maximize our level of output. That's what production possibilities frontiers tells us. We use technology to help us in our production. So as technology improves, such as the use of artificial intelligence, we're advancing our ability to produce more goods and services. So as I am manufacturing more computers and cars, I'm using improved technology, such as artificial intelligence and robotics. The idea is that we're producing more economic growth. So as our technology improves, there's a shift in our production possibilities frontier to the right. When we see that shift to the right, we're adding on additional production. So a shift from point A to G, we have an increased amount of production in our computers and about a small increase in our cars. So I'm able to produce 100 more computers and 50 more cars. That's an increased level of production, a shift to the right, the production possibilities frontier, which means I have increased capacity to produce more based off of improved technology. In this course, we're focusing on macroeconomics. We're looking at the country as a whole, the macro level, the wide economy. And we're looking at things like inflation, unemployment, economic growth. These are all macroeconomic factors. Microeconomics, which is, I believe, Econ 202, that focuses on the individuals, the households, and the firms on a micro scale, on an individual scale. That's the difference between the two. So this course is macro. Your other economics course is going to be micro. In economics, we look at what people are saying. Remember, economics is the study of the economy. Okay? And in the economy, people say things that are positive or negative. For example, you may have just heard that next month in September, the Federal Reserve is going to cut interest rates. That's a positive statement for the economy. And because of those positive words, the stock market went up, which means that unemployment might become affected in a positive way, possibly, or wages might go up, something like that. Usually when there's a positive statement, there's a positive outcome. Some statements are prescriptive. When somebody says the government should raise the minimum wage, that's a prescriptive statement. They're saying, hey, you should do this. That's prescriptive. As you may be aware, here in DC, our national economy, we have advisors, and these advisors give advice to the president, and they give advice to members of Congress, and they give advice to people in charge of policy, and they try to advise on what should be done to improve the economy. Now, of course, there's opposite opinions on pretty much everything here in DC, as you know. Here in Washington, we have the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. We also have the Department of Treasury, the U.S. Department of Labor, the U.S. Department of Justice, the U.S. Congressional Budget Office, CBO, and, of course, the Federal Reserve. So having all of these offices here in D.C., as you can imagine, all of the powers concentrated here in D.C., and having all of those collective bodies at the table advising on what should be done, working collaboratively, they try to produce the policies that they think is best. So they talk and they try to communicate what their ideas are. And, they use the media, and then they go through a legislative process to review any type of proposals. And of course, then there's a decision that's made on the best policies. That's the way it should normally work. Of course, a lot of economists, they disagree with each other. They have varying viewpoints. And that's fine. That's normal discourse. That's the way it's supposed to work. And that's also how we create what we think is, or what we know to be valid. And we also propose alternative theories. The idea here is that discourse is a normal thing, especially in economics. One person might say, oh, the economy is doing real well. Another person might say, no, it's not doing so great. The reason for that is because they have opposite viewpoints, and they might understand different theories. So we have to use our best scientific judgment in order to determine if a theory is valid or not. And of course, we use statistics behind that to understand it. Here's an example. We have two individuals with the same amount of usage of utilities. Their incomes are drastically different, which means their tax rates are also a little different. But take a look at this. Someone with a higher income has a lower tax rate than somebody with a lower income. Why might that be? Based off of local taxes, the person with they try to, normalize or create a baseline for taxation to make things equitable, right? The thing with equity is that it's not always fair, right? Here's some more examples. Rent control. Rent control is very common in New York City. I'm sure it's very common in other large cities where they say that the rent can only go up by a certain percentage. We call that rent control. It can only go up a certain percentage every single year. So, for example, 5% per year is the rent control. That's the most it can go up. And that's dictated by whatever city council that it governs your area. And so rent control is something that's disputed among both the owners of households and those renting. Yeah. Other economists disagree on things like trade barriers. Some oppose it or some are for it. A trade barrier is a tariff or an import quota. A tariff is a tax on goods that are imported into the country. An import quota is a limit on the amount of goods that can be imported into the country. Here's an example. Toyota, the car manufacturer, Japanese car manufacturer, when they import cars from Japan to the United States, there's a limit on the number of cars that they can import. We call it an import quota. We also have tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on those imports. Okay, that's what trade barriers are. Some economists oppose trade barriers, and some economists are for it. And those trade barriers have effects. There are two huge concepts in economics. We call that supply and demand. Supply and demand dictates the prices of goods and services in an open economy. We have an open economy, free and open economy here in the United States, and supply and demand is what dictates the prices that we pay for those goods and services. When supply is up, demand is typically up. When supply is down, demand can sometimes also be down. The two are correlated, they're related. Here we see a downward sloping demand curve. The demand curve is typically always downward sloping and to the right. And we can see the various prices and quantities on this demand curve. As the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. That makes sense. It's kind of like when you go to the grocery store and the price of oranges went up. It went up from 50 cents to $1. And you normally buy 4 oranges a week. And when the price went up from 50 cents to $1, you might only buy 2 instead of 4. Okay, you're going to buy less of something when the price of that thing goes up. That's pretty normal. When the price comes down, the quantity demanded goes up. So the lower the price, the more you might want of that particular good. So that's the relationship for demand. When there's a shift in or change in the price, for example, when the price goes up, the demand curve shifts to the right. When the price goes down, the demand curve shifts to the left. The way we calculate the slope of the demand curve is we take the change in y divided by the change in x. That's how we find the slope of the demand curve. The change in y is the rise divided by the change in x, which is the run. That's how we find the slope. Yeah. Hopefully you learned this already in the statistics course. If not, you'll learn it here, and then you'll also learn it in the statistics course. The demand curve is always going to be downward sloping to the right. The supply curve is always going to be upward sloping and to the right. If it's horizontal, the slope is at 0. If it's vertical, the slope is infinite. And there's some instances where that might be the case for both either supply or demand. And I'll show you some examples as time goes on. So here's how we calculate the slope of a demand curve. So we have a change in y over the change in x. So here we have the change in the y-axis, which is a change in price. So here we have a change in price of $2. $6 minus $8 is negative $2. Over the change in x, which is the quantity, the change in the quantity is 21 to 13. That's a change of 8. So minus 2 divided by 8 will give us our slope, in which case is negative 1/4. In economics, especially when we do graphing, it's all about cause and effect. When there's a change in price, there's going to be a change in the quantity demanded. Yep. So those are the two variables that we look at. We exclude everything else to keep things simple. On the supply side, the slope is always upward and to the right. This just shows you another correlation, just for examples. Okay, so it's all about causality. When there's a change in price, there's going to be a change in the quantity demanded. That's what you need to know, especially for this course. These are just some more examples of the correlation between the change in something related to the change in something else. Okay, so that's the end of the second chapter, Thinking Like an Economist. So for this chapter and for this week, there's two items you need to look at. One is going to be the hypothesis assignment, and the other is going to be the Chapter 2 quiz. The hypothesis. So the way this is going to work, and I apologize that this particular one seems to be broken right now because I just tried to open it up and it doesn't seem to be working appropriately. But the way that it would normally work, and I'm going to actually fix it real fast. The way it would normally work, and of course it doesn't want to do that now. So the way it would normally work is that you'll open this up, you're going to see a video playing, you'll highlight the text on the right side, and you'll make a notation. A notation, very simply put, is how you would write a note about something, right? So you'll highlight the text, you'll write your annotation, and then once you're done with that, a few days later, you'll reply to 2 of your classmates. It's kind of like a discussion board, but it's in the form of a video rather than reading text. Yeah. So that's the primary difference. And so I'll get that fixed as soon as we're done with class tonight. So just give me a little bit of time just to fix that. But that's for Chapter 2. So let me go ahead and I'm going to stop this part of the recording, and I'm going to start a new recording for Chapter 3. So please stand by.